The sun was setting over the quiet suburban neighborhood, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. It was the kind of evening where everything seemed peaceful, almost too peaceful. Jamal, a 12-year-old boy with big dreams and an even bigger heart, walked down the street with his beloved dog, Max, by his side. Max wasn't just any dog. He was Jamal's best friend, protector, and the one constant in his life since his father's passing 2 years ago. The pair shared an unbreakable bond, one forged in trust, love, and countless adventures together. Jamal clutched his backpack tightly as he made his way home from the corner store. Inside the bag were a few groceries his mom had asked him to pick up, along with the notebook he always carried, filled with his sketches and ideas for a comic book he dreamed of publishing one day. Lost in his thoughts, he didn't notice the shadowy figure lurking behind the parked cars along the street. The man had been watching Jamal for a while, sizing him up, calculating his move. He was scruffy, his clothes worn and mismatched, and his eyes darted nervously as if he were always on edge. To him, Jamal was an easy target, just a kid, distracted, and unaware of his surroundings. What he didn't account for was Max. Max, a large golden-furred shepherd mix, trotted happily beside Jamal, his leash loosely held in the boy's hand. His ears perked up at every sound, his tail wagging lazily with each step. But Max wasn't just a happy-go-lucky pet. He was fiercely loyal and incredibly smart. He could sense things, danger, fear, and when something just didn't feel right. And tonight, something definitely didn't feel right. The man made his move as Jamal turned the corner into a quieter, less crowded part of the neighborhood. Without warning, he lunged forward, grabbing Jamal's backpack and yanking it with such force that Jamal stumbled and fell to the ground. "Give it here." The man snarled, his voice rough and filled with desperation. Jamal froze, his heart racing as he looked up at the stranger towering over him. Max's reaction was immediate. His playful demeanor vanished, replaced by a low, menacing growl that echoed in the stillness of the street. He planted himself firmly between Jamal and the man, his sharp teeth bared, and his eyes locked onto the intruder with an intensity that sent chills down the man's spine. "Get back," the man yelled, trying to scare Max off. But Max didn't budge. He wasn't just protecting Jamal. He was warning the man that he had made a grave mistake. Jamal, still on the ground, held tightly onto Max's leash, his mind racing. Fear gripped him, but he also knew one thing for sure. Max wouldn't let anything happen to him. The tension in the air was thick, the man hesitating as he realized this wasn't going to be as easy as he thought. And then, in a split second, everything changed. What happens next will leave you on the edge of your seat. Stay tuned as we unravel the rest of this gripping story, where courage, loyalty, and unexpected twists prove that love and trust can overcome even the darkest moments. The man froze for a moment, his eyes darting between Max and the backpack clutched tightly in his hands. He hadn't expected the dog to react this way, and now he was caught in a moment of uncertainty. Max's growls deepened, his body tense as if ready to spring forward at any sign of harm to Jamal. The street, so quiet just minutes before, now felt charged with an invisible energy, like something was about to happen. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest as he stayed on the ground, his mind racing. He had always known Max was protective, but seeing him like this, fearless and ready to defend him, filled him with a strange mix of relief and worry. What if the man tried to hurt Max? What if he had something worse than just his hands? Jamal couldn't let anything happen to his best friend. The man's hand trembled slightly as he tightened his grip on the bag. His desperation was palpable, written all over his unshaven face. He looked like someone who hadn't eaten a proper meal in days, his clothes hanging loosely on his thin frame. But even as Jamal took in these details, he couldn't ignore the danger. This wasn't just about a stolen backpack. This was about safety, his and Max's. "Call him off, kid," the man barked, his voice shaky but trying to sound firm. "I don't want to hurt him, but I will if I have to." Jamal didn't respond right away. He could feel Max's tension through the leash, the way his muscles coiled like a spring. The boy's fingers tightened around the leash as he whispered, "Easy, Max. Easy." But Max wasn't backing down. His eyes stayed locked on the man, his growls rumbling like distant thunder. "I don't have much," Jamal finally said, his voice trembling. "It's just some groceries in my notebook. Please just let us go." The man hesitated, his gaze shifting to the bag. For a split second, Jamal thought he saw something in the man's eyes. Regret, maybe even shame. But it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by the hardened mask of someone who had been pushed too far by life. "You don't get it, do you?" The man snapped. "I don't have a choice." And that was when Max barked, a sharp, commanding sound that cut through the tension like a knife. The man flinched, taking a step back, his grip on the bag loosening. It was clear now that he was as afraid of Max as Max was determined to protect Jamal. The balance of power was shifting, but the situation was far from over. Jamal's mind flashed back to the first time he met Max. He had been just a puppy then, a scrappy little thing with two big paws and eyes full of curiosity. Jamal's dad had brought him home as a surprise, saying every boy needed a loyal companion. They had bonded instantly, and over the years, Max had become more than a pet. He was family. After his dad passed, Max had been there for every tear, every quiet moment of grief, every step toward healing. Jamal couldn't imagine life without him. The man took another step back, and for a moment, Jamal thought he might run. But then the man's eyes narrowed, and his desperation flared up again like a flame refusing to be extinguished. He raised his voice, trying to sound more threatening. "I'm warning you, kid. Call him off, or—" A distant sound interrupted him, a car engine rumbling down the street, headlights cutting through the growing darkness. The man whipped his head around, the light catching his face and revealing a raw, almost haunted expression. He knew he didn't have much time. Max took advantage of the distraction. With a sudden burst of movement, he lunged forward, barking furiously. The man yelped and dropped the bag, stumbling backward in panic. All right," he shouted, his hands raised defensively. "I'm done, okay. Just keep that dog away from me." Max stood his ground, his tail stiff, his bark echoing in the night. Jamal scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding as he grabbed the fallen backpack. He didn't dare take his eyes off the man, who was now retreating, his steps hurried and clumsy. "Go," Jamal yelled, his voice shaking but firm. "Leave us alone." The man hesitated for just a second, his eyes darting between Jamal and Max. Then, with a muttered curse, he turned and ran, disappearing into the shadows of the neighborhood. The sound of his footsteps faded, leaving behind only the steady hum of the car as it passed by without stopping. Jamal exhaled shakily, his legs feeling weak beneath him. He knelt down and wrapped his arms around Max, burying his face in the dog's fur. "You saved me, boy," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You really saved me." Max licked Jamal's face, his tail wagging softly now that the danger had passed. For a moment, it felt like everything was okay again. But as Jamal stood up and adjusted his backpack, a nagging thought crept into his mind. Who was that man? And why did he seem so desperate? As they made their way home, Jamal couldn't shake the image of the man's face. It wasn't just the anger or the fear. It was something deeper, something that spoke of a story untold. Jumal didn't know why it bothered him so much, but he couldn't stop thinking about it. And as they turned onto his street, the comforting glow of his house in the distance, he realized this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Jumal pushed open the front door, Max trotting in beside him, still on high alert. The familiar scent of dinner wafted through the house, and his mom's voice called out from the kitchen. "That you, Jamal? You took your time. Hope you didn't forget my list." He set the backpack on the counter and forced a smile as his mom came into view, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "I got everything," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Max stayed close to his side, his head brushing against Jamal's leg, as if sensing his lingering unease. His mom's eyes narrowed as she looked at him more closely. "You okay, baby? You look shaken." Jamal hesitated, glancing at Max. He didn't want to worry her, but the memory of the man's face, desperate, angry, yet somehow lost, was fresh in his mind. "I'm fine," he said finally. "Just ran into some weird guy on the way back." Max scared him off. His mom's expression shifted to concern as she reached out to touch his arm. "What do you mean, weird guy? Did someone try to hurt you?" Jamal bit his lip, unsure how much to share. "He tried to take my bag," he admitted. But Max didn't let him. "It's okay, Mom. We're okay." Her face paled, and she pulled him into a tight hug. "You should have called me Jamal. I would have come to get you. You don't just walk away from something like that and act like it's no big deal." Her voice wavered, betraying her fear, and Jamal felt a pang of guilt for not telling her sooner. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I didn't think he'd follow me or anything." Max barked softly, as if to reassure them both. His mom glanced down at the dog, her expression softening. "That dog," she said, shaking her head. "He's worth his weight in gold. You make sure to keep him close, you hear me?" Jamal nodded, but as his mom returned to the kitchen, her unease lingered in the air. He couldn't blame her. He was still trying to process what had happened himself. But something about the man stuck with him, a nagging feeling that wouldn't let go. That night, Jamal couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as Max curled up on the floor beside him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the man's face again, heard the crack in his voice when he said he didn't have a choice. It didn't sound like an excuse. It sounded like the truth. Jamal didn't understand why, but he felt a strange pull to know more, to figure out what had driven someone to such desperation. The next morning, Jamal decided to take a different route to school, one that passed by the alley where the man had disappeared. Max walked beside him, his leash snug in Jamal's hand. The streets were busier now, filled with the chatter of kids heading to class and the hum of cars rushing by. But as they approached the alley, the noise seemed to fade, replaced by a heavy silence. Jamal hesitated at the entrance, peering into the shadows. He didn't see anyone, but the air felt thick, like it was holding onto the tension from the night before. Max sniffed the ground, his ears twitching, and Jamal took a tentative step forward. "Looking for trouble?" A voice called out, startling him. Jamal turned to see a man leaning against the wall nearby, his hands shoved into the pockets of a worn jacket. He was older than the man from last night, his face lined with years of hardship, but there was something familiar in his wary eyes. "You shouldn't be hanging around here, kid," the man continued. "Not safe." "I'm not looking for trouble," Jamal said quickly, his grip on Max's leash tightening. "I just thought I saw someone here last night." The man raised an eyebrow, studying Jamal with a mix of suspicion and curiosity. "Lot of people pass through here," he said after a pause. "Most of 'em got nowhere else to go." Jamal frowned, the man's words striking a chord. "Nowhere else to go," he repeated. "Like homeless." The man nodded, his expression hardening. Life ain't kind to everyone, kid. You got a roof over your head and food in your belly. You're already luckier than most around here. Jamal didn't know how to respond. He thought of the man from the night before, his gaunt face and desperate eyes. "Do you know him?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The guy from last night. He tried to rob me." The man's eyes narrowed, and he glanced around as if checking to see if anyone was listening. "Could be anyone," he muttered. "But if it's who I think it is, yeah, I might know him." Jamal's heart raced. Why would he do it? He said he didn't have a choice. The man let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Ain't that the story for most folks down here? No job, no money, no hope. You get desperate enough, you start doing things you swore you'd never do. Don't make it right, but it's the way it is." Jamal felt a lump form in his throat. He thought of his own family, his mom working late shifts to make ends meet, the nights they had to stretch meals to last a little longer. But they had Max. They had each other. The man from last night didn't seem to have anyone. "Do you think he's dangerous?" Jamal asked, his voice uncertain. The man shrugged. "Desperation makes people dangerous. But if you're smart, you'll stay out of it. That dog of yours saved you once. Don't push your luck." Jamal nodded slowly, but as he walked away, his thoughts swirled with questions he couldn't shake. Who was the man? What had pushed him to the brink? And why couldn't Jamal let it go? By the time he reached school, he had made up his mind. He didn't know how, but he was going to find out the truth. Max had protected him last night, but now it was Jamal's turn to act, not out of fear, but out of something stronger. Compassion. Jamal spent the rest of the day distracted, unable to focus on his classes. His thoughts kept circling back to the alley, the man, and the stranger's words about desperation. He didn't know why he felt such a need to understand, but it gnawed at him like an unsolved puzzle. Every time he tried to push it aside, Max's bark from the night before echoed in his mind, a reminder of how close he'd been to real danger. After school, Jamal decided to go back. He knew it was risky, but something deep inside told him he couldn't let it go. He didn't tell his mom. She'd never let him leave the house if she knew what he was up to. Instead, he grabbed Max's leash and headed out, pretending it was just another walk around the neighborhood. The sky was overcast, and the chill in the air made everything feel heavier. Max seemed alert as they approached the alley again, his nose sniffing the ground and his ears twitching at every sound. Jamal felt his stomach tighten, a mix of fear and determination propelling him forward. When they reached the alley, it was eerily quiet. Jamal hesitated, glancing down at Max, who stood still, his body tense. "It's okay, boy," Jamal whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was reassuring Max or himself. He took a deep breath and stepped into the shadows. This time, he wasn't alone. Further down the alley, near a stack of old crates and discarded boxes, he saw a figure hunched over, rummaging through a torn bag. It was the man from last night. Jamal's heart raced as he recognized the same threadbare jacket, the same gaunt face. Max let out a low growl, and the man's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as they locked onto Jamal. "You again," the man said, his voice rough and tired. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate, like someone used to being on edge. "What do you want, kid? Didn't get enough of a scare last night." Jamal swallowed hard, gripping Max's leash tightly. "I'm not here to fight," he said, his voice steadier than he expected. I want to talk." The man let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Talk? What could you possibly have to say to me?" Jamal took a cautious step forward, keeping Max close. "Why did you do it? Last night, I mean. You said you didn't have a choice." The man's expression hardened, and for a moment, Jamal thought he might just walk away. But then something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of vulnerability that he seemed to quickly suppress. "You wouldn't understand," the man muttered, turning back to the bag he'd been rummaging through. "Try me," Jamal said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "I know what it's like to struggle. My mom and we don't have much either." The man paused, his shoulders stiffening. He glanced over his shoulder, his gaze scanning Jamal, as if trying to decide whether he was being sincere. Finally, he sighed and sat down on one of the crates, his movements heavy with exhaustion. "You really want to know," he said, his tone almost challenging. "Fine, I'll tell you." Jamal nodded, his heart pounding as he stepped closer, Max still on alert by his side. "I used to have a job," the man began, his voice low and gruff. "A real job, factory work. Long hours, but it paid the bills. Then the place shut down, and just like that, I had nothing. Spent months looking for work, but nobody was hiring. Lost my apartment, lost everything. Now I'm out here, scraping by, hoping to make it through another day." He paused, his jaw tightening as he looked away. "Last night, I was hungry. Desperate. Saw you and thought, maybe, just maybe, I could get enough to make it another day. I didn't want to hurt you, kid. I'm not proud of what I did." Jamal listened in silence, the man's words hitting him harder than he expected. He thought of his mom, working overtime just to keep the lights on, and how close they'd come to losing their own home after his dad passed. It wasn't hard to imagine how someone could end up in the man's position, but it still didn't make what he'd done right. "You could have asked," Jamal said softly. "I would have helped if I could." The man let out a bitter laugh. "Help? Nobody helps people like me. People cross the street to avoid me, pretend I don't exist. You're lucky, kid. You've got that dog, a mom who cares. You've got hope. Me, I've got nothing." Jamal opened his mouth to respond, but a sudden noise cut through the air. A loud clatter from the far end of the alley. Max barked sharply, his body stiffening as he turned toward the sound. The man tensed, his eyes narrowing as he rose to his feet. "What was that?" Jamal asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the shadows of the end of the alley. A figure emerged, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a menacing presence. He moved with a deliberate confidence, his eyes scanning the alley, until they landed on the man beside Jamal. "There you are," the newcomer said, his voice cold and sharp. "You think you can just take off and not pay what you owe." Jamal felt a chill run down his spine as he glanced at the man beside him. His face had gone pale, and his hands clenched into fists. "I don't have it," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I told you, I just need more time." The newcomer sneered, taking a step closer. "Time's up. You know the deal. Either you pay, or we settle this another way." Jamal's pulse quickened as he realized the man from last night wasn't just desperate, he was trapped. Whatever trouble he was in, it was bigger than anything Jamal had imagined. Max barked again, his growls growing louder, but Jamal could feel the tension rising, the situation teetering on the edge of chaos. "Stay out of this, kid," the newcomer said, his eyes flicking briefly to Jamal and Max. "This ain't your problem." But it was too late. Jamal was already in it, and the stakes had just gotten higher. Jamal's heart pounded as the newcomer stepped closer, his heavy boots echoing against the concrete. Max barked fiercely, baring his teeth, his stance protective. Jamal tightened his grip on the leash, his instincts screaming at him to run, but his feet remained rooted to the spot. There was something about the tension between the two men that felt impossible to leave behind. The man from the night before, desperate and broken, now looked cornered, like a prey animal with no way out. Look, I don't have it, the man repeated, his voice more defiant this time, though fear flickered in his eyes. But this isn't the way. I'll figure it out, I swear. The larger man laughed coldly, crossing his arms as if amused by the plea. You've had your chances. You think promises are enough now? You think they'll keep you safe? This is your last warning. His eyes narrowed, the threat in his tone unmistakable. If you're not paying, you're paying another way. Jamal couldn't stay silent anymore. That's not fair, he blurted out, his voice cutting through the tension. Both men turned to him, their expressions unreadable. Max growled low, his gaze fixed on the larger man. Fair, the newcomer scoffed, his tone dripping with disdain. You've got no idea what's going on here, kid. Stay out of it. This isn't your business. Jamal straightened his shoulders, his fear giving way to anger. It is now. He didn't take anything from me. Max stopped him. But I can see he's just trying to survive. You can't keep pushing people like this. The larger man's expression darkened, but before he could reply, the man from the night before held up a hand, stepping between Jamal and the looming figure. Enough, he said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. Leave the kid out of this. He's got nothing to do with it. Jamal's eyes darted between them, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He wasn't sure what he expected, but the tension was thicker than ever, and he could tell there was more to the story. What's really going on here? He asked, his voice quieter now, but no less determined. Why is he after you? The man hesitated, his jaw tightening as if weighing whether to answer. Finally, he sighed, running a hand over his face. It's not just about money, he admitted. It's about control. People like him, they prey on the desperate. Offer help when you've got nowhere to turn, but it always comes with strings. And when you can't pay them back, he trailed off, the implications clear. Jamal felt a wave of anger and sadness crash over him. He'd heard stories like this before. People getting trapped in cycles they couldn't escape, forced into impossible situations just to get by. But seeing it up close, hearing the desperation in the man's voice, made it feel so much more real. He looked at the larger man, his jaw set. That's not right. You can't treat people like that. The newcomer smirked, clearly unfazed. Right or wrong doesn't matter, kid. What matters is power. And I've got it. He doesn't. He pointed a finger at the man. And you've got until tonight to figure out how you're gonna pay up. Or else. Jamal's stomach churned as he watched the larger man turn and walk away, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. Max barked once more, his growls following the man until he disappeared around the corner. The alley felt colder, emptier, in his absence, but the tension lingered. You shouldn't have gotten involved, the man muttered, his voice laced with frustration and gratitude. You don't know what these people are capable of. Maybe not, Jamal admitted. But I couldn't just stand there. You're not a bad person. You're just stuck. He hesitated before continuing. What are you going to do? Do you have anyone who can help? The man shook his head, his expression grim. No one. That's how they get you. They isolate you, make sure you've got nowhere to turn. And once you're in for life. Jamal looked down at Max, who had finally stopped growling but remained watchful. He felt a pang of helplessness, but he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that he had to do something. What if we figure out a way together? He said slowly. There has to be a way to get you out of this. The man stared at him, a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope in his eyes. Why would you do that? Why would you risk getting mixed up in all this? Jamal thought about his mom, about Max, about everything he had that this man didn't. Because it's the right thing to do, he said simply, and because no one deserves to feel like they have no way out. The man didn't respond right away, his gaze drifting to the ground as if struggling to believe Jamal's words. Finally, he nodded, a small, reluctant gesture. "All right," he said. "But if we're doing this, we've got to be smart. These people don't play fair." Jamal nodded back, determination settling in his chest. He didn't know how they were going to pull it off, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't turn his back now. Max barked softly, as if agreeing, and Jamal felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As night fell, the air grew colder, and the city seemed to hold its breath. Jamal sat in his small living room, staring at the clock on the wall. Max lay at his feet, his ears twitching at every small sound outside. Jamal's mom was working late, unaware of the events that had unfolded in the last 24 hours. Jamal's thoughts raced as he replayed the conversation in the alley, the desperation in the man's eyes, and the threat from the larger, menacing figure. He had promised to help, but now the weight of that promise felt heavier than ever. A knock at the back door startled him, and Max leaped to his feet, barking sharply. Jamal rushed to quiet him, his heart pounding as he moved toward the door. When he opened it, the man from the alley stood there, his face pale and drawn. He looked over his shoulder nervously before stepping inside. "They're watching me," the man said in a hushed voice, glancing around as if expecting someone to jump out from the shadows. "I don't know how long I've got before they come for me." Jamal nodded, his own nerves on edge. "We'll figure this out," he said, trying to sound confident. He'd spent the afternoon researching, trying to understand the kind of people they were up against. Everything he'd read painted a grim picture, but he refused to let fear take over. "I've got an idea," Jamal said after a moment. "But you have to trust me. We're going to need Max." The man looked down at the dog, who stood protectively between them, his tail still. "The dog?" he asked, confusion evident in his tone. "What's he going to do?" "Max is loyal," Jamal said, kneeling to scratch behind the dog's ears. "And he's smart. He can distract them long enough for us to get what we need." The man hesitated, but finally nodded, clearly too desperate to argue. Together, they slipped out into the night, Max leading the way. The streets were quiet, the city's usual buzz muted under the weight of their mission. Jamal led them toward a rundown warehouse on the edge of town, a place he'd overheard the larger man mention during his threats in the alley. The warehouse loomed ahead, its windows broken and its walls covered in graffiti. Jamal motioned for them to stay low as they approached. Max moved silently beside him, his instincts sharp. They crept around the back, where a faint light glowed through a cracked door. Inside, voices echoed through the cavernous space. Jamal peeped through the opening and saw the larger man from the alley, standing with two others. They were gathered around a table, counting wads of cash and sorting through small packages that Jamal could only guess were illegal goods. The sight made his stomach churn, but he couldn't back out now. "Stay here," Jamal whispered to the man, who nodded nervously. He then turned to Max and whispered a command. The dog's ears perked up, and without hesitation, he darted into the warehouse, barking loudly. The men inside froze, their heads snapping toward the sound. One of them began, but before he could finish, Max bounded around the room, knocking over crates and scattering papers. The men shouted, chasing after the dog as he led them in circles. While they were distracted, Jamal slipped inside, his heart racing. He spotted a bag near the table, filled with what looked like stolen wallets and IDs. Evidence that could expose the men's operations. He grabbed it and turned to leave, but as he did, one of the men caught sight of him. "Hey, who's that?" the man shouted, pointing toward Jamal. Max barked again, drawing their attention as Jamal bolted for the door. The man from the alley was waiting outside, his eyes wide with panic as Jamal thrust the bag into his hands. "Run," Jamal shouted, and together they sprinted into the night, Max close behind. They didn't stop until they were several blocks away, panting and out of breath. Jamal could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears as he handed the bag back to the man. "This has everything," he said. "Take it to the police. They'll have no choice but to go after them now." The man stared at the bag, his hands trembling. "You risked everything for this," he said, his voice filled with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "Why would you do that?" Jamal shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Because no one should feel like they don't have a way out." Before the man could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air. Jamal's heart sank as he realized the men from the warehouse must have called for backup. They hadn't escaped unnoticed. The man's face twisted with fear, but Jamal placed a hand on his shoulder. "Go," Jamal urged. "Take the bag and go. Max and I will handle this." The man hesitated for a moment before nodding. He disappeared into the shadows, the bag clutched tightly in his hands. Jamal turned to Max, who stood ready, his tail wagging slightly as if to say, "We've got this." The police arrived moments later, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Jamal raised his hands, explaining everything as calmly as he could. To his relief, the officers listened, and when the man returned with the bag of evidence, it was enough to turn the tide. The men from the warehouse were arrested, and the larger man's grip on the neighborhood was finally broken. But just as Jamal thought it was over, one of the officers pulled him aside. "You're lucky, kid," the officer said, his tone serious. "But be careful who you trust. Not everyone is as loyal as that dog of yours." Jamal frowned, unsure of what the officer meant. It wasn't until later, when he realized the man from the alley had disappeared with the bag and the money, that the officer's words hit home. Despite it all, Jamal couldn't bring himself to regret his actions. Max barked softly beside him, and Jamal smiled, knowing that sometimes loyalty and doing the right thing mattered more than the outcome. The neighborhood felt different the next morning, quieter, almost lighter, as if a heavy weight had been lifted. Jamal walked Max along their usual route, the leash loose in his hand. He could feel the eyes of a few neighbors on him, whispers drifting on the cold morning air. Word traveled fast around here, and people had started piecing together the events of the previous night. As they passed the alley, Jamal paused. The place felt smaller somehow, stripped of the danger that had hung over it like a storm cloud. He thought about the man from the alley, the fear in his eyes, the gratitude in his voice, and later, his sudden disappearance. Jamal wondered where he had gone and whether he'd used the bag of evidence and cash for a fresh start. Part of him hoped so. He'd seen enough of the man's struggle to know that everyone deserved a second chance. Max tugged at the leash, breaking Jamal's thoughts. The dog's energy was infectious, his tail wagging as if the world had already righted itself. Jamal couldn't help but smile. Whatever doubts he had, he knew one thing for sure. Max had been his hero through it all. He knelt down and scratched behind the dog's ears, earning a happy bark. "You're something else, you know that," Jamal said softly. "I don't think I could have done any of this without you." Later that day, as Jamal sat in his room, he reflected on everything that had happened. His mom had come home early that morning, tired from her night shift, but curious about the commotion. Jamal had shared the whole story with her, well, most of it. He left out some of the more dangerous details, not wanting to worry her any more than necessary. She had listened intently, her expression a mix of concern and pride. "You've got a good heart, Jamal," she'd said, resting a hand on his shoulder. "But you've got to be careful. Not everyone's going to appreciate what you do for them." Her words echoed in his mind now, filling the quiet of his room. She wasn't wrong. The man had vanished, taking the money and the evidence with him, leaving Jamal to deal with the aftermath. But even so, Jamal didn't regret his choices. He'd done what felt right, and that was enough for him. By the afternoon, the police had finished their investigation. They confirmed that the men from the warehouse were involved in a long list of crimes and that their arrest would have a ripple effect, making the streets safer for everyone. The officer who had spoken to Jamal the night before returned to thank him for his bravery. "You helped us make a big difference," the officer said. "But remember, this isn't something you should handle on your own. Next time, come to us first." Jamal nodded, appreciating the advice, even if he wasn't sure how much he'd follow it. Sometimes doing the right thing didn't wait for the perfect plan. Sometimes it just happened in the moment, messy and uncertain but necessary. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Jamal found himself back outside, sitting on the steps of his building with Max at his side. The dog seemed content, his head resting on Jamal's knee as they watched the street come alive with activity. Kids played basketball at the corner, their laughter ringing out. A couple of neighbors chatted over their fences, their voices warm and easy. The fear that had gripped the block was gone, replaced by a quiet sense of relief. Jamal thought about the man one last time, wondering where he'd ended up. He'd probably never know, but that was okay. Not every story needed a perfect ending. Sometimes it was enough to know that you'd done your part and hoped for the best. Max barked suddenly, pulling Jamal from his thoughts. A boy from the basketball game had lost his ball, and Max darted after it, his tail wagging as he chased it down. The kids cheered as Max returned the ball, his tongue lolling happily. Jamal laughed, watching the scene unfold. Max had a way of bringing joy wherever he went, and Jamal couldn't imagine his life without him. As the evening settled in, Jamal stood and stretched. He gave Max's leash a gentle tug, and the dog followed willingly, his steps light and carefree. Together, they walked back inside, ready to leave the chaos of the past few days behind them. In the quiet of his room, Jamal looked at Max and smiled. "You know," he said, his voice soft, "you're not just my dog. You're my family, my partner, my best friend." Max tilted his head as if he understood, his eyes full of loyalty and love. Jamal lay down on his bed, Max curling up at his feet. The world outside kept moving, but for now, everything felt right. The danger had passed, the neighborhood was safer, and Jamal had a deeper understanding of the power of loyalty, bravery, and doing what was right, even when it was hard. As sleep began to take over, Jamal thought about the future. There would always be challenges, always be moments of uncertainty. But with Max by his side, he knew they could face anything together. The bond they shared was unbreakable, and that was more than enough. The city lights flickered outside the window, casting a warm glow across the room. Jamal closed his eyes, his hand resting on Max's fur. In that moment, all was quiet, all was calm. And for the first time in days, he felt truly at peace.